A daily activity and thought log is a cognitive technique that focuses on the validity of dysfunctional beliefs. Being able to be aware and recognize when we're making these thinking errors gives us the opportunity to potentially correct them by praising the evidence for and against the distorted thinking and the conclusions that we draw from them. So for example, you could be walking down the street and you see your best friend and they walk straight past you. Had you had a fallout the week before, you might think, are they ignoring me? Are they blanking me? And you feel overwhelmed, sad, frustrated, and you might send them an erratic text drawing a conclusion that they're blanking you or they're ignoring you, or you might sort of go into social avoidance with them, when ultimately it might be they didn't see you. And if you thought they didn't see you, you'd feel different to the way you felt if you thought that they were blanking you. So a logical thing to do would be to send them a text, are you okay? Or maybe give them a call, are you okay? And it might be that the way we perceive the situation is different to what the situation is. Or it might be the way you perceive the situation is correct, yet we've got limited control over that. But the best thing to do would be to find out if they're okay. Because many of us have been in situations where we've made conclusions, believing in the accuracy of our own perceptions, memories and thoughts, the existence of systematic biases and distortions in our thinking. We always draw conclusions. I'm sure you've sent texts in the past, someone's cut you up on the road, you've had road rage, you haven't thought, have they racing their wife to hospital for labour, they didn't see you, they did a mistake, we all make mistakes. So we sort of jump onto the conclusions, we personalise it, we emotional reason, we get frustrated, we magnify the negative and so on and so forth. There are times these beliefs that we have become outdated, instructive and intuitive response becomes maladaptive and dysfunctional, which causes conflict with ourselves and the environment. In past tutorials I talked about various ways to challenge these beliefs. Today we're going to focus on activity and thought log as a technique to be able to redirect these beliefs in such a method that we can sort of keep an activity sheet and we can log the problematic situation, the associated thoughts and feelings and behavior, which often work as a background narrative altogether. They amalgamate altogether, and this is a way to imagine a melting pot, to take them out and dissect our thoughts, the situation, our emotions, our behavior, and sort of see things more clearer and more logically, to examine the evidence, the interpretation situation, so we can examine what the evidence is and we can see it more logically. So in the example of the friend walking straight past you, we can sort of focus on the situation and then examine the evidence, our behavior, our emotion, and so on and so forth, and reappraise the situation, which will prompt a different behavior and will feel differently about them too. Because most often when we rate the emotion, it's different to the original rating we had for it. Let's say you're really overwhelmed, your friend didn't say hello or let on to you. Out of 10, with 10 being high, you're at 9. There's a very good chance by going through this process, the emotion won't be as overwhelming or as high as it originally is. And by doing that, then we can choose a different response in the future. We can reappraise the situation, and by reappraising the situation, we then have a different response to what we normally had. So the first step in the process is to take the situation, where, what, when, with whom. So for example, I was working with this woman one time and she was applying for jobs and she was getting interviews, and she had a bad experience in an interview many years earlier, and this was really having a big impact on the way she was perceiving the chances of getting a job. And she was perception of getting a job was, I'll never get a job, all eyes on me, it's frustrating, I get nervous, I get anxious, I get frustrated. And equally I've worked with people in various situations. It could be presenting, it could be even getting on public transport, it could be walking to the shop, and so on and so forth. So the situation could be quite variable. What I would say when it comes to things like anxiety and depression and sadness and things around those areas, it's always useful for them to go to see a medical person first. I'm not a medical person, I deal with coaching and the mind. And why I say that is because anxiety can have many underlying issues that could be treated. And it's not to say you can't work with them if that's the case, yet all that said and done, it's always a sensible thing to do if they have got anxiety in a bus, for example, and they're worried about their heart beating really, really fast, and they're really concerned about it, or they get a physiological symptom like a pain in their shoulder or their chest or something like that. It's always sensible to make a suggestion, well, have you seen or would consider seeing a medical person first? Because there could be an underlying issue that needs treating. That's not so you can't work with them, but it's always better to be safe in that situation. Certainly that's what I do when I work with people in certain situations. They talk about physiological pain, anxiety. Just to be safe, I always say my suggestion before I work with you would be to go see a medical person to see if there's any underlying issues for the anxiety or the pain you're experiencing, and so on and so forth. And all things being well, we can start to work. So the situation, we take that into consideration first of all. The second thing we do is describe the emotion, step 2. So the emotion the woman talked about in the interview was really overwhelmed. She used overwhelmed a lot. And you could just get them to describe it in a word, in a metaphor, in a gesture. So they could describe it in a gesture, like that. However is easiest for them to describe it. And then you can rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being high. It's a way to quantify it. And we can sort of re-rate it in the end to see if we're sort of coming down. And once you've done that, and this could work someone in the bus, for example, going to the shop, doing a presentation, a number of things, you can rate the emotion. And what we do then in the first step is to understand the negative thought, what thoughts, memories they had in that specific situation that caused them that feeling, getting that sort of causal link. And this can be pretty challenging for the person to work with, because it's not always easy to recall because it's not in your conscious awareness. Sometimes I'll do in vivo. I'll get them to re-experience them and push them as much as they can tolerate. So if they're not comfortable experiencing the situation again, then we sort of go as far as they can. It's ideal if they can write it down when it's happening, but that's not always logistically possible, because sometimes they might be driving and they feel a bit panicky when they drive. You wouldn't want someone to write when they drive. So it's not always practical to do that, but we do the best we can with what we've got. Then we can do the evidence for that supports the thought. So the woman I was working with for the interview, she said that whenever she went to an interview, it didn't work out well, people didn't like her, and she was emotional reasoning, saying that she just felt that people don't like her, and all eyes were on her. If she doesn't get a job, she was catastrophized, she'll end up on the street with no money, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying or suggesting these things aren't possible, of course, but let's sort of see it more rationally and take the evidence for that. So I said, how do you know they don't like you? The feeling, talk about the feeling. And she tried to rationalize and couldn't think of a way. I said, how do you know all eyes are on you and they're focusing purely on you? And what is the process of an interview anyway? What about when your eyes are on them? So I'd use a process, and you can use processes around here if you choose to, like arrow, model, questioning, and dig a bit deeper if you want to. If otherwise, you can sort of get an idea of the evidence. Say, imagine a table and the legs that support the table. What is supporting that sort of belief system? And it might be they have a point, and it might be some things they're thinking are correct, yet control what you can or let go what you can't, and go from there. But there's a very good chance too some of the things that they are jumping on conclusions with just their own perception of the situation. You can reappraise it. So you can work on reappraising if you choose to. The fifth part is the evidence against. Okay, what's the evidence against that? So the evidence against the person saying they don't like me. What evidence do you have? What is the evidence against that? And every time I go into interview, they don't like me. I feel all eyes on me. They're judging me. What evidence do you have for that? What evidence do you have against that is the fifth part of the process. And I would talk to the person I was working with in relation to interviews and say, what evidence do you have against that? And she said, well, I've gone to interviews in the past and I've got the job. I get on with people when I get the job. There are some people I don't get on with, and that's pretty normal, one would think. And so that's quite useful, and that might be someone who gets overwhelmed going shopping and they think something bad's going to happen. It might be, what evidence do you have against something bad happening? Well, I've been to the shop a million times before and I've been okay. And it might be the person on the bus who thinks that something terrible is going to happen. What evidence do you have against that? Well, I've caught the bus 1,000 times, I've been okay. So this is quite useful to use and get them to think outside the box, the evidence against that situation. And then the sixth step in the process you can use is alternative thoughts. Think of different ways you can see things, taking all the evidence into account. How else can you see the situation? So in the case of walking down the street and your best friend walking straight past you, it might be that you see it as they didn't see you, and that might prompt a different response, taking all things in consideration, because you sort of take the evidence for and against all in consideration. You think, well, actually they might not see me. I've known this person for many, many years. They haven't done this before. Why would they do that now? In the case of the interview, people don't like me, I'll never get a job again, and so on and so forth. Well, for and against, you've been to interviews before and succeeded, in the ones that you didn't succeed, there could have been 100 applicants. And every other applicant that didn't get the job, how might they feel and think as well? So that's sort of giving you an idea in the time we've got that you can do. And the step 7 could be to re-rate the emotion. So then you could take the situation again. So you could look at the situation again and re-rate the emotion. So now, for example, you reappraise the situation with your friend not seeing you as they didn't see you. The reappraisal could be they didn't see you, and the emotion you re-rate could go from a 9 out of 10 with 10 being high to a 5. And it's not always going to go all the way down completely. There might be some there, but we're making progress. That's the important thing with this process. It could be the interview. The woman I was working with, the interview, it was a 10 original emotion. When we sort of went through the evidence in a lot of detail, it went down to about a 1, and she felt freer and more liberated. And that's not to say everyone in your work is going to go to a 1, but there are people that will reduce significantly. And obviously the way we feel about a situation is going to impact the way we behave as well, because it's all interconnected in a certain way. Other things you can ask too, which are quite useful too, is physical sensations. What did you notice in your body when it happened? Where did you feel it in your body physiologically? What are you responding to? What button is it pressing? What's the worst thing that can happen? The best thing, the most realistic thing. So these are things you can ask as well. From the point of view of seeing things differently, alternative, more balanced way of seeing things, it's about sort of stopping the person, take a breath, and you can get them to say, you can ask them, is it fact or opinion? What's the bigger picture? Is another way of seeing it? What advice would you give someone else? So for example, the woman, the interview, I said, just, stop and pause and take a breath there for a moment. And what's the bigger picture? So you're going for a job, you've got this goal of getting that type of work. Okay, is there another way of seeing the way you see the situation? And she says, well, there's other people who have gone for the job that don't get it too. It's quite a demanding job. A lot of people are applying for it. If I keep going, eventually I'll get that job, or I can work towards getting it. What advice would you give someone else? And that helps us to externalize, detach it. So we can externalize the situation and take the emotion out of it. And her advice to someone else would be, okay, when you go to an interview, do the very best you can. Compose yourself, do the best you can. And it's normal to be under some sort of pressure and feel a bit nervous when you really want something. That's okay, as long as you channel it in the right way. And that's a quite useful thing to say. And I do that when people I work with who are working on presentations, delivering presentations, they feel a bit nervous. I say, how would you advise somebody else in that situation? Sports people, they get a bit nervous, how would you advise somebody else in that situation? And just in general, really, it's quite useful to be able to externalize it. How would you advise someone in this situation as well? So that's a cognitive technique. The daily activity and thought log is quite a useful technique. That's all the time we've got for now. You're welcome to email if you have any questions, comments, otherwise. There are various ways you can use the technique and process, and there's variable ways that people use it too. This is one way of using it. It's not the only way, but it's quite a useful way. But feel free to email if you have any questions, comments, otherwise. Live with passion. Boom!